Fantastic. Hey, if we haven't met, my name's Jonathan. I'm the pastor here. What an awesome day to be at church. I'm fired up to preach, so y'all better buckle up. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting, and we're going to dive in. Now, as some of you may know, you may not know this yet about me, but I've kind of embarked on a new adventure in this year of my life. I've started something new that I've never done before, and I have stepped in. I've taken the responsibility of being a T-ball coach for the first time in my life. Dads, anybody out there, you know, right? 5-year-olds, okay? And it is hands down the most hilarious part of my week every single week because these kids have no clue what baseball is. They don't even know how to play, right? They don't know the rules of the game. In fact, T-ball looks a little more like a combination of tackle football and Easter egg hunting, like put together. Because they have no concept of positions, right? Somebody steps up to bat, they knock one off the tee, and it doesn't matter if you're in left field or first base, wherever that ball is, the entire team chases the ball, they dogpile the ball, and whoever comes out with it at the end is like, I won the game. And you're like, no, you got to throw it to first now. And like, get the guy out, and he's like, why would I do that? I got the ball, right? This was the point. And they're like, no, that's not the point. And so what ends up happening, and this is what I learned for my first time ever coaching T-ball, is that the big victory of the year, like the big accomplishment of the year, is if your team can actually get somebody out. If somehow your kids can actually like successfully, catch a ball or stop a ball and throw it to the first baseman who can then catch it and get the person out. That's like massive. It's the equivalent of a walk-off grand slam in the bottom of the 9th inning of the World Series. And so if you're a parent in T-ball, the only thing you're living for, because kids, they know how to hit the ball off a tee, they can run the bases, but getting someone out like actually requires expertise and skill for a 5-year-old. And so I just got to brag just real quick on the Yankees. We've already gotten 3 people out this year in 4 games. That's right. This is a huge, I don't want to attribute it all to my coaching prowess, but at least a little bit is because of that. And here's how it happened. It was so funny. Some kid on the other team got up and just smacks a line drive right to our second baseman, who just so happens to be in the ready position instead of eating dirt, which was a miracle. And so the ball lands in the kid's glove, and he's so scared and surprised. He's like, wow, where'd it come from? And he's looking at it, and I say, throw it to first. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay. So he takes it as the rest of the team is about to tackle him for the ball. Literally, they're all encroaching on him. And he launches it to first base, and our first baseman isn't even looking at him. Our first baseman is like smiling at his mom in the stands, and his glove just so happens to be opened in the right direction, and it lands in his glove. And he goes, what's this about? And his foot happens to be on first base, and he's out of there, man. I was like, come on. The stands go wild. The parents are going nuts. Everyone's talking about it all day long. And why? Why are we talking about it? Because it's not normal. Things that are abnormal grab our attention. We stop and stare and say, wow, can you believe that just happened? That hasn't happened all year. It may never happen again. It shouldn't have happened. That's not normal. And so right now, we're in the middle of a series. If you're new with us or just starting, we're in a series called This Is Us. And in this series, we are looking at the values that define us as a church. And we're going through who God has called us to be with things like Jesus is always going to be our lead story as a church. We exist to multiply as a church. We exist to share the gospel with others. And a few weeks back, we wrote names on light bulbs and just intentionally thought about who are we praying for in our lives. And this week, we're going to talk about the fact that as a church, we want generosity to be normal. We want generosity to be normal. And the reason we chose that wording, the reason we chose that phrase, generosity is normal, as one of the values of our church, is simple. Because generosity is not normal. Generosity is not normal in our culture. It's not normal in our world. And if Christians would come together and live generously with their lives, it would literally cause the world to stop and stare and say, what is going on over there? It's the equivalent of like a 5-year-old throwing a perfect toss to first base and the first baseman catching it. Everyone would go like, what is happening at Rolling Hills Church? They're living so different than the rest of the world. And I got to say, every major move of God from the very beginning in Acts chapter 2, when the Holy Spirit first came on the church, until today, every major move of God is always preceded with the radical generosity of God's people to fulfill the mission of the church. These two always go hand in hand. And so as we're thinking about it this week and as we're looking at this idea of generosity, I feel like we have to understand, if we're going to fulfill the vision and the mission that God has given us as a church, then it's going to affect the way that we spend our money, the way that we spend our time, and the way that we spend our talents. And so to start things off, to kind of give us an anchor point for today's talk, I want to look at a definition of generosity. And here's what I believe we're going to learn from the Bible today, what the Bible teaches about generosity. I believe generosity is the sacrificial and prioritized giving of your time, talent, and treasure. It's the sacrificial and prioritized giving of your time, your talent, and your treasure, or your money. And this is one of those things that touches on us at the core of humans, because all of these things, when it comes to generosity, are things that we like to keep close to us, or things that me included as a pastor, are things that I struggle with being generous with my time, my talent, and my treasure. And really, if you look at the world as a whole, the way that our society operates and functions, we kind of have a 3 progression stage in life, and it starts with live, it goes to save, and then it goes to give. And here's what it looks like. When we think about our money and our finances, we live. Hopefully it's coming up. I'm going to keep talking. If it shows up, great. But here we go. Live, save, give. This is how it works for us. Live, save, give. Most of us, we consume our money first, or we use our time and our talent on us first. If we have some left over after that, we save for us in the future to provide for future consumption in our lives. And then if there's anything left at the end, we'll give. Maybe if somebody gives us an emotional pitch about some cause in Africa, or there's a specific need at church for a campaign or something like that, and we have some left over after living and saving, then we'll give. And it's crazy because for most of America, this produces what I like to call the crazy worry cycle. When we live like this, okay? When we think about our finances, we're dominated by this idea of worry. We have anxiety. Will we have enough? Will we have enough to spend on ourselves mostly? And that kind of goes to this idea of, like, when I'm stressed or anxious, what do I do to kind of alleviate that pain? Well, I spend more than I make. So I go buy something. I go spend more than I make in some way, and this produces debt. And if you look at the statistics, most Americans are living in pretty extreme levels of debt. And then that produces no margin in life, so what do? We worry. And then we spend more than we make, and it increases debt, and we have no margin, and it creates this crazy cycle in life. And what I think Jesus would like to do with us this morning, just through his word, is say, I want to give you a new crazy. I want to give you a new crazy way to live, not according to the way of the world, but a way that produces peace. And if you live according to this kind of crazy, I promise you're going to be happier. You're going to be more free in your soul regarding finances. You're going to be generous, and you're actually going to find that you have more money because you're wiser in how you use your money. You're wiser in how you use your money. And so in order for us to kind of dive into this and to look at what Jesus thinks about this, I want us to look at a parable that most of you may have heard of, but you never thought of it in context to generosity. You never thought of it in context to generosity. And if you have a Bible, you can open with me to Luke 14, or if you have a phone, you can open it to Luke 14. And I want to start in verse 12. And the context of this entire story is that Jesus is at a dinner banquet. He's at a feast that he's been invited to. And at the feast, at the banquet, he says this in verse 12 to the host, the person who invited him. He said to the man who had invited him, verse 12, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, what the heck is Jesus saying right there? At first glance, it may appear that Jesus is saying, hey, if you ever have a dinner party, never invite your friends or your family or your relatives or your rich neighbors or anybody over that you like. That seems a little extreme, Jesus. What are you actually saying? That's actually not what Jesus is saying at all. He's actually setting up a contrast for us between how we spend money on ourselves and how we give money away. Generosity and spending money on ourselves, how we see these things in contrast to one another. And one of the things that we have to understand about this parable and about this day is that the entire Greco-Roman culture was built on something called the patron system. The patron system. Now, in most villages or towns, there were certain wealthy people. And if you were a business owner or you were running for political office or you had some cause that you needed a wealthy person to support you in, the goal of your life at that point was to try and grab the attention of one of the wealthy people in that town and try and make them your patron, your supporter for your cause or your business or whatever it may be. Now, in order to kind of win their business or win their favor or win their support of your cause, you would throw a dinner. And you would invite all of your relatives, all of your influential neighbors and friends and rich people that were in your network. They were in your network to this dinner, and you would invite the wealthy person to your dinner. And if the wealthy person showed up at your meal and he looked around and said, wow, this is a pretty strong network. I see some lawyers here. I see some businessmen here. I see some politicians here. If I join this network, if I support this man's cause, then I get the benefits of his network. And here's how it worked. If that man decided, if the rich or wealthy man decided to join the cause of the person who had invited him over for dinner, and he needed a favor one day, he could call that man up and say, hey, I need a favor. And I know you know a guy who knows a guy, so you can get things done for me. And that's how all of these patronage dinners worked. It was social climbing. It was how can I build my network of rich and powerful people and substantial people? And this was just how it worked, so I can get things done in life and advance myself in life. There were no quote-unquote corporate ladders back in the day or career paths for people. It was all about who you know and how you can leverage relationships to get you better relationships in life. And Jesus, at the end of the day, we'll see he's not condemning that in and of itself. He's not saying, hey, you should never do that. He's just contrasting it with generosity. He's setting up a compare and contrast situation because he says, and I love this because I imagine the rich man, the patron who invited Jesus, and think about this. Why did he invite Jesus to his networking dinner? Because at some point he thought, man, this guy Jesus, he's got a lot of people following him. He's got a lot of people listening to him. He might be the guy to actually overthrow the Roman oppression, and one day he might be a very important person to have in my network. One day he might be a very important person to have on my side when I need a favor to call him up. So I'm going to invite him to my dinner and kind of introduce him to my people. So he can decide if he wants to be one of my people or not. And here's the point of the parable. Never invite Jesus to your dinner party, okay? You never know what he's going to do or what he's going to say. And the point is proven so clearly in verse 12 because he looks at this rich man and he addresses the whole crowd. He looks at this guy who is a patron who's trying to draw him into his network. He addresses the crowd and literally he says what I just read to you. Hey, when you throw one of these things, don't invite all of your wealthy, influential, substantial people in your life. Instead, invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind who can't pay you back, who can't give you favors in return. And so he says to this man in front of all of his friends, hey, next time you throw one of these parties, don't invite any of these people. How awkward is that moment? How incredible is the audacity of Jesus in that moment to say that to those people? But what is Jesus saying here? Is he really saying to this man, you should never associate with those people anymore? No. It's a Jewish idiom. It's an idiom in one language that if we don't understand the context of what Jesus is getting at here, we could literally be like the meanest, rudest people on the planet, be like, hey, look, Jesus told me I should never hang out with my friends or relatives or anybody of influence or my neighbors in life, so I'm just going to hang out with poor people all the time. And that's not what he's saying. A few chapters earlier, Jesus said this. He goes, hey, if you want to follow me, hate your father and mother. Did he really mean to literally like hate your father and mother? No. Jesus would have been contradicting one of the commandments, that the commandment is to honor your father and mother. So is he setting up a contradiction or is he saying something else? What Jesus is touching on here is an order of priority. He says, you should prioritize me so much in your life. I should be such a priority for your time and your talent and your treasure and your affection that it's almost like you hate your father and mother. That your love for me and your priority of me in your life is so above anything else on this earth that even the dearest, closest relationships to you pale in comparison to the priority you put on me. And in the same way, when Jesus says to them, hey, don't invite your friends over for dinner. Instead, give everything you have and invite, the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. He's not saying you should never associate with your friends and you should only always have dinners for the poor. What he is saying is he's setting up a contrast. And this got me. This got me so bad this week because if I stare in the mirror and I see what this text is saying, if I stand under the weight of God's word right here and say, God, is this true of me? I was sorely convicted this week because what he's saying is this. He goes, I'm not saying to you never associate with these people and only associate with these people. I'm saying the amount of money, because this represents two things, the amount of money you give away to charity, to your local church for the good of others versus the amount of money you spend on yourself, the amount of money you give away should so far exceed, abundantly above anything beyond you spend on yourself that it should pale in comparison. The priority to generosity in your life should be above and beyond anything that you spend on yourself. Ouch! That's painful. I mean, that's Jesus stepping into each and every single one of our business right now and just looking at us and saying, do you want to follow me? And if I'm honest in my vulnerable moments, I'm like, no, that hurts. Who lives like that? Jesus, that is crazy. Nobody should do that with their life, right? That would mean like, are you saying I live as a pauper? And he's like, no, I'm not asking you to live as a pauper. I'm just saying to switch it. To enter into a new kind of crazy, to prioritize me, to prioritize your generosity and the way you give for the sake of my mission on this earth. My mission is so important, and the call of God to show the love of God to the people of the earth and to care for the poor is so important, it should take priority in your life. And so what he's inviting us into and what he's saying to us is literally following me is going to touch every aspect of your time, your talent, and your treasure. It's going to touch every single aspect of your life. And I'm calling you to a new kind of crazy where your generosity is sacrificial and it's prioritized. In order to live like this, it's sacrificial and it's prioritized. And he gives us a new kind of crazy cycle, but it starts with peace. It looks like this. The new crazy cycle starts with peace. And it starts with peace because instead of living and then saving and then giving at the end, we prioritize giving. And it becomes sacrificial and it becomes prioritized. The first thing we do in our life and say, God, I'm about your mission. My money has a mission. My treasure has a purpose in this life. I know that I'm not going to get to keep it when I come home to you. And I know that ultimately you're the source of all things in my life. So I'm a steward of your money and I'm giving back to you what you've already given to me. And I'm prioritizing your mission on the earth. And what happens when we give God the first fruits of our life is suddenly the anxiety and the worry that we have when we think we're in control of our money begins to dissipate. When we think we are the ultimate security for our own lives, the worry and the anxiety begins to dissipate. The angst and the anxiety we have around money of, will I have enough? Will I be able to provide? Will my security blanket last through economy ups and downs and through getting fired or job transitions? All begins to go away because now your source is not your job. It's not just your talents. It's not just your time. It's God. It's God. And this is one of the best ways to free your heart up from fear and anxiety around your money. Give some away. And I'm not just saying give it here. We'll get to that at the end, but we'll talk about where you give your money. But this is really, and this is, this is not a tithing sermon. This is not me saying you all need to get out your checkbooks and give to our church. We don't pass the plates on purpose here. We're very intentional about why we do things as a church. But what I am saying is I want you to stop and think about your relationship to your money. Your relationship to your finances, because in El Dorado Hills, California, the greatest danger to our faith is probably not radical Islam coming through these doors and threatening to blow us up for being Christians. Sorry, that was pretty extreme, but we're throwing that out there. The greatest danger to our faith, the greatest danger to our hearts is going to be our finances. Will our finances be our master? Or by the grace of God, will it be a tool in our life to where we give generously to others for the sake of God's mission? And so when we're thinking about this, it's not a tithing talk. It just comes down at the end to what is your relationship in your own soul with your money? How does your soul relate to your money? Is it your ultimate source of identity and security, or is God? And so when you give first, and when you save second, when you live last, like Jesus is asking us to do in this thing, and this is not something that you can probably just switch the flip and say, I'm going to go home and shift it all. We're looking at all of our budgeting, everything. I'm going to, do all of this in one fell swoop. This is a journey for all of us. This is a journey for me. This is something Lindsay and I have always prioritized giving in our lives to church, to missionary, to the poor. We have 3 different categories of giving. And I'm not sitting up here saying we've got this all right or we do this right. I'm just saying this has been something we've done from the very beginning of our marriage. And the older we've gotten and the more we've had and the more that life has advanced for us, the harder it has been to do this. And the harder it's been to live this way, the more I begin to think that I am the ultimate security of my life and that I deserve everything I have. That if it comes to me, it's mine to consume instead of mine to give. And so really what God is calling us to is generosity that requires sacrifice and priority in our lives. I came across a story this week. It was kind of a parable that captured this idea so well, especially this idea of sacrifice. It was about a farmer who had a cow who was pregnant, about to give birth to a calf. And he went to his wife and he said, honey, I really think that the Lord is calling me to give away 50% of the proceeds from this calf. I think God wants me to sell the calf when it's born and to give away 50% of the proceeds of this calf. And she says, sweetheart, that's amazing. That's going to require faith. That's a priority for us. It's going to require sacrifice. Okay, I'm all in. And through the course of time, they began to realize that the cow was actually pregnant with twins. And he went to his wife and said, honey, God has blessed us. Now I'll just give all the proceeds from one of the calves away and we can keep the proceeds from the other. It's like God gave us the money back that we were going to give to him. Now we have 2 cows. That's incredible. Well, after they were born, a few months went by and one of the calves got sick and died. And the farmer came to his wife and he said, honey, I've got some terrible news. The Lord's calf died today. The Lord lost his calf today, honey. I don't know. I told God which one was his and which one was mine when we started this process. And he clearly knew that was his and this was mine. And he killed his own calf. So, I'm not responsible for that. That's on him. And the point of the parable, the point of the story is this is the way it works in our lives. It's always God's calf who dies. It's always the Lord's calf who dies. When push comes to shove and we get pinched and it gets down to that vacation or that outfit or whatever it is in life, my financial plans or goals or saving for the future and being generous, it's always the Lord's calf that dies. And I think in our own lives, what we have to do is press against. There's nothing that presses into the depth of your faith and my faith like how we spend our money. Money tells a story, and the story never lies. I'm going to say that again. Money, how we spend and choose to give and live on our money in our lives, it always tells a story about what we value, and it never lies. That's what Jesus says about it. He says, where your heart is, where your treasure is, your heart will follow. Your treasure is telling a story, and it never lies. And for us, this is something we have to come face to face with in a unique way in America. It's something that we have to wrestle with and say, God, is my money on mission? Or is it all about me? And Jesus flips this thing and he just says, the way you should be generous as followers of me should be the lead story in your life. And people literally would stop and stare. That was like a kid throwing out a runner on his way to first base. That was so crazy the way that person lives with their time, their talent, and their treasure. The only way this kind of crazy makes sense, the only way this makes sense at all, Jesus gives it to us at the end of this chapter in another parable about a banquet feast, about the same type of feast that he's attending. He said the only way this makes sense is through the lens of grace and through the lens of eternity. This makes no sense to live this generously because we will feel this in our lives if we choose to be this generous. We will feel it. It makes no sense unless the gospel is true and there is an eternal perspective involved here. And what Jesus says in verse 14 right here, he says, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. You're not getting repaid in this life for living like this. This is crazy to live like this in this life, but a day is coming when it will all make sense. When Jesus returns and you step into eternity, whichever comes first. That's the only way. Are you living life in such a way that it only makes sense when you step into eternity? Whew. I have to look at myself in the mirror and ask myself the same question, because there's a lot of times when I answer that question, no. And Lord, I want to follow you in my finances. I want to follow you in how you're calling me to live, but this is hard. And so Jesus gives us some help, and he says, when you think of your life through the lens of grace, think of it like this. He goes, imagine a rich man, a patron, inviting tons of people over to his house for a feast. He gives this parable at the end of chapter 14. He goes, at first he invited all of his rich neighbors and relatives and his network of people that he normally would for a feast like this, but all of them were busy. One said, I can't, I have a business transaction. Another said, I can't, I'm marrying my daughter. Another said, I can't, I've got relatives who've died. And they all had good reasons why they couldn't make it to the feast. So the rich man told his servants, he said, go out into the city streets and bring me the poor, the lame, the blind, the beggars. And all of those men and women, they accepted the invitation gladly. And then he said, now, because there's still room at my table, go out to the highways and the byways and the hedges and find the people hiding along the roads. And the reason they're out in the country, the rural poor, is because they're on the run from the law. They're on the run for their lives because they're robbers, they're thieves, they're outcasts. And he's like, I love it. He uses the word compel them to come. You're going to have to argue them in. To make them believe that I actually want them to sit at my table, because they're not going to want to come with you. This is so crazy what I'm inviting them into that they're not even gonna believe that the invitation is real. They're gonna think you're trying to bring them into jail or something. You have to argue them in. Make them come with you. And the amazing thing is this, that on Calvary, when Jesus hung on the cross on Calvary and he looked at heaven, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? When Jesus came to the door of his Father's feast in heaven, God said, turn away from me, you who are cursed by me, to his own Son. So that the rest of us who are in the hedges and the highways and the byways can come in, even though we have nothing to bring. He's saying when you look at this through the lens of grace, he goes, heaven is not a potluck dinner. You got nothing to bring. You don't have to bring a side. You don't have to bring any dish. The table is prepared for you, and I curse my own Son so that you can come in. Now come, one and all, everybody who doesn't even deserve to be here, come and sit with me at my table. And when you understand that you are the beggar, you are the lame, you are the blind, you are the outcast, you are the one on the run, and God invited you in, then you will say, just like Paul did, everything compared to knowing Jesus is rubbish. It's like trash compared to knowing you. And you're going to want other people to experience the same joy that you've experienced from grace. And you're going to say, how can my money be on mission? And if you don't feel like your money can be on mission here, then go on a church where you feel like it can be. It's not about you tithing to Rolling Hills Church. It's about you having a completely new paradigm with how you relate to your finances and how you give. And you should be giving absolutely 100% to causes that break your heart. And to causes that you're grateful for. In fact, if we're thinking about how we distinguish our giving, I want us to look at two things. You want to give from a grateful heart, and you want to give from a broken heart. What are you grateful for? What are you grateful for? Maybe it's this church. Maybe it's the story that God is writing in this church. Maybe it's what God has done in your life and what you see him doing through this church. You should give to this church. Maybe you're a parent and you have a college student off at college somewhere and they're getting impacted by a church in their town. You should give to that church. Praise God that your kid's even going to church while they're in college. Amen? But you should give to that church if you're grateful for that church. You should give to things that break your heart. What breaks your heart? Lindsay and I have some very specific things that break our heart that we give to. One of those is Compassion International. We sponsor kids. You should give to things like that. And here's the deal. Some pastors, other friends of mine would say, man, don't say that to your church. Don't tell them to give their money other places. But I'm like, look, there is plenty of money to go around. I don't have a scarcity mentality. And if we would actually buy in to the blessing of generosity, there would be enough water for all the boats in the harbor to rise and for the mission of God to be fulfilled with the gospel reaching to the ends of the earth. I really believe that. And I really believe that this church is called to a vision and a mission of reaching the greater Sacramento area. And I believe God is going to bring finances to accomplish that mission. But he's going to do it through your generosity, through our generosity as a church, with our time, with our talents, and with our treasure. And here's the deal. The only way that this makes sense is when we see what God has done for us. That's what Paul says. When you see the generosity of God for you, it compels you to sacrificially and prioritize your giving to others. And when you understand that there is a long play in view called eternity, and there's a repayment at the resurrection of the just that only comes from God, and every sacrifice you feel like you made on this side because you chose to live the crazy way that Jesus invited you to live in is repaid in a way that you can never imagine. This is the new kind of crazy. And I want us to think about, as I close, a few thoughts just to close. You all know how to give. You know where our buckets are here. You know how to give online. You know how to give by text message. You know how to give. You know how to give to your charities. You know how to give to whatever it is you want to give to. But the question for us is this: are you willing to make the next step to making generosity a priority in your life? Are you willing to take Jesus at his word and say, God, I want to prioritize this and I want to feel it. I'm going to make some sacrifices to be a generous person in my life. And so maybe you're somebody that just gives occasionally to a cause, whether it was a house in Mexico or something like that. I think God is inviting you to take a step towards generosity by saying, okay, go from a little bit here and there from the bottom of the barrel to 1% at the top every single week, or every single month, or every single paycheck. Think about ways that you can prioritize giving in your life. Maybe you give 1 or 2%. Maybe it's a step to 3 or 4%. Until you start to feel it and say, Lord, every single week I'm saying that money is not my master and I'm investing it in your kingdom. And I feel this, but I'm prioritizing it for you, just as you called me to do. Maybe it's a step from 5% to 7, or from 7 to 10, or maybe you already give 10%. But God is inviting you to go abundantly beyond all that you can ask or imagine. And this is one of those things where in our life, as we begin to take steps, we are going to get off the crazy cycle of worry with our finances. And we're going to find a peace that we did not know was available when it came to money, because no longer are you're going to see this with your life, where maybe this feels like a cliff you're about to step off of and you can't imagine that God is going to catch you. You are going to see that somehow God has got you, and he's providing, and he's the source. And he's inviting you into a journey with him of blessing and of generosity that is beyond anything that you can imagine. And so right now we're going to close today with communion. And we're going to reflect. In light of generosity, we're going to reflect on the most generous gift ever given to mankind, and that was Jesus on the cross for you and for me. Because this is the source of it for us. This is what cuts away our security the most, is when we see the love of God for us. So our ushers are going to come down and they're going to pass out communion. As you're taking the juice and the cracker this week, just begin to say, thank you, God, for what you've done for me. Let's invite our ushers down. We're going to close after this.